Hello, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to this week's podcast. The great Joseph Ellis, my friend Joe Ellis of Mount Holyoke, went to William and Mary, has written a slew of books. You know some of the books. You've heard me interview him many times and rave about his greatness. He's somebody that I so deeply admire. Passionate Sage, 1993, The Character and Legacy of John Adams. American Sphinx, 1996, the book that brought us together, The Character of Thomas Jefferson. 2000, Founding Brothers, A Revolutionary Generation. That one was a bestseller. 2004, my second favorite of his books, His Excellency, George Washington. Then there's 2010, First Family, Abigail and John Adams, and so on and so forth. This is one of the great historians of our time, and it is possible for me to be able to know him and bring him to you because of the pandemic. It used to be when I would want someone like Joe Ellis to be on this program, he would have to find his way to a radio station, an NPR station, or we'd have to pay for a studio. That's complicated, and it's easy to say no because you have to get in your car and drive somewhere, and there's a fee for the audio engineering there, and it's just one hassle too many. But once the pandemic came and Zoom technology suddenly burst upon the scene, I've been able to get people that would otherwise never be available to us. And so if you can help get others, if there are people you want us to interview, if there are people that you'd like to encounter and listening to America, just let us know. They almost always say yes now, and it's so important. So I've probably had 20, maybe even more podcast conversations with the great Joe Ellis over the past 10 years or so, maybe 12 years. Our friendship was renewed. We first got to know each other in Ken Burns' editing booth up in Walpole, New Hampshire, long ago. And as things happen, you sort of lose track of each other to a certain degree, see each other from time to time. But we don't attend the same events. He's on the East Coast. I'm out in the Great Plains. But then Zoom technology makes it possible. And he's golden. He's got this new book, and he's trying to sort out exactly how we should think about the twin tragedies of the American experiment, the systematic and often ruthless dispossession of Native Americans, and of course the issue of race and slavery, which is of course far from over yet. The issue of Native Americans is far from over yet. When we talk about the ideals of the revolution, Joe is always the first one to say slavery and dispossession of natives they knew were incompatible with the ideals of the American experiment. So think about that. Jefferson knew this, Washington knew this, Madison knew this, Hamilton knew this. They didn't all know this. Many of them were vicious racists. But the great ones knew better, and Jefferson certainly knew better. And the perplexity for me is how Jefferson could live his life in the midst of this thing when he knew from all of his deep reading in the Enlightenment and in the history of human rights, he knew that this was not only incompatible with the ideals of the revolution, but that he would be judged and should be judged historically for his own failure either to do anything about this himself. He freed a handful of slaves in his life. They were all related to him. And that he was unable to prevent slavery from moving into the American West. In fact, changed his mind late in life and began to say diffusion of slavery into the West was maybe a good thing. There's a certain spiritual hardening of the arteries in Jefferson. But he knew this was wrong. He knew that he was violating the most sacred principles of his existence. He knew that this was a blot upon his historical standing. And yet, as I say often, Jefferson was engaged in what we call magical thinking. He thought somehow, some benign way, slavery will just fade away and we will all be okay. And it'll be a white nation with a handful of African Americans. And he thought that somehow the problem of Native Americans would benignly fade away, that they would get on board with the American dream and become indistinguishable from Irish Americans and Slavic Americans and Italian Americans and so on. This is one of the strengths of Jefferson, his kind of utopian dream of America. And we're all, even Joe Ellis, the Adamsite, is still intoxicated by this. He still harkens to Jefferson's vision, because that vision is of a country that we want to live in. And we have never really lived in it. We've gotten closer than we are now. We've pulled back a little bit here. Joe's a long-term optimist and a short-term pessimist. I don't know how I feel about all of that, but I know that talking with Joe Ellis is great. Let me just say that Joe has a lot going on, and he's growing older now, and he forgets a few things. But it's worth it. I supply the data whenever I can. When he says, "Oh, who was that?" "Oh, yeah, that was Eli Whitney." This is the inevitability of growing older, and I don't think that's any reason not to prize him for his insights and for his deep historical research. But it is the case that I'm perfectly happy to, whenever I can, to say, "Oh yeah, you're talking about that was the Green Mountain Boys. Oh yeah, you're talking about that letter that Jefferson wrote to Adams in 1815." I feel it in my own brain too. Don't get me wrong, but I think that it's a pleasure for me to bring him to this program, and I try to interrupt as little as possible, although we have to keep it as a conversation. But it is an honor. It is a deep honor and privilege to know Joseph Ellis, to have worked with him in the studio of one Ken Burns, to continue this dialogue at this point in our lives, and to bring it to you, because you're talking here. I'm neither here nor there. I'm just a guy from the Great Plains who dresses up and does stuff and leads to, Joe Ellis is a major intellectual figure. I almost said influencer, but a major historian of the early national period. I mean, if you are a graduate student today going to Yale or Harvard or Columbia or Brown or Stanford or UCLA or UC Berkeley or, for that, or Grinnell or Pomona or whatever, and you are talking about the early national period, you are going to have an encounter with Joe Ellis. That's Joe Ellis. And so if you can help, please do. You're going to like this program. His new book I will be getting. It's not available quite yet, but it'll soon be here. The Great Contradiction, the Tragic Side of the American Founding. So let's go to the show. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkins. Across from me virtually is my old dear friend, Joseph Ellis. I've known Joe since 1998, when we met in the editing room of one Ken Burns in Walpole, New Hampshire. And as you know, if you have listened to this program, we were both big figures in the documentary on Mr. Jefferson, but we also were rebuked by the great one because we were heckling. We were in the back. We were
the bad guys.
We were doing wit. We were making comments. We were laughing, and he finally stopped and said, "Hey, you two, either stop or get out." And so then we, like the bad children in a school, we brought it down a little bit, but never enough.
He does keep asking us back, though, periodically, that we get as big a play as we
can't get enough of us. We don't have any. We don't have anything to say, Joe, but he loves our faces. All right.
I will use this opportunity to promote his upcoming film, which is a 6-episode thing on the American Revolution. I think that Ken Burns has done more to influence America's understanding of American history than any other professional historian.
Well, maybe. I mean, yes, because documentary is different from history. But one of the reasons that I keep coming back to you and calling you and wanting you to be a part of my life and on this program is because you are that rarest of individuals. You write books that are academically solid and get the highest regards from fellow historians, and yet people who are not PhDs in history and who are not academicians can read them and benefit mightily from them. And we've talked about that. You have a gift.
I work really hard to make it look easy, and I don't write for other academics. The audience I have in my mind is the kind of students I taught at Yale and at Mount Holyoke and at Williams. They were all really smart. They were really interested in American history, and they had one other thing in common. They didn't know anything.
Well, they know less today, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
Now, Joe, you've written a gazillion books and you've won awards. After the Revolution, 1979. My favorite of all of your books, Passionate Sage, on John Adams in 1993, American Sphinx about our man Jefferson. That's how we came together. And I'm in that book, strangely enough. His Excellency, 2004. My second favorite of your books, I think that's an outstanding treatment of President Washington, American Creation. I'm going to come back to that. First Family, Abigail and John Adams, 2010. Revolutionary Summer, 2013. The Quartet, 2015, and so on.
Hey, I've been busy. I've really done a lot, haven't I?
You have done a lot. You won the National Book Award for nonfiction. You won the Pulitzer Prize for history for Founding Brothers. His Excellency was on the New York Times bestseller list. You've also won other awards. You hear, like, when you say Ken Burns, okay, that's one medium. But there are very few historians who have done what you have done to bring alive a period of American history. And I just want to come back to that. So you have a new book that's coming out, The Great Contradiction, the tragic side of the American founding. And Joe, before you start to talk about it, let me ask you this. In 2007, you published American Creation, Triumphs and Tragedies at the Founding. So how is this different from that?
The subtitle of that book was
Triumphs and Tragedies of the Founding of the Republic.
Right. This is about that side of the story. That is, it doesn't completely stay away from the major achievements of the founding generation, which I do believe are the greatest political leaders in American history, but it focuses on their two tragic failures. One is the failure to end slavery, or at least put it on the road to extinction. And the other is the failure to reach a just accommodation with the Native American population, which Washington, in the book, makes a heroic effort to achieve.
A late life attempt to really come to terms with both of those issues.
That's correct. I mean, of all the major founders, all of them are going to look bad on occasion, and Jefferson on several occasions.
More often than not these days.
But Jefferson is like the Mona Lisa of American history, or he's like those blimps above the Super Bowl, flashing inspirational messages to both sides.
You know, your metaphors, your tropes. First, it was American Sphinx. I disagreed with that publicly back when that book came out. Now it's this book. He's what, a blimp?
I mean, I think there are two things you have to say about Jefferson, and that are equally important. He wrote the most important 56 words in American history.
Maybe in human history.
Maybe in human history, yes. He failed to come to terms with ending slavery because he couldn't believe that blacks and whites could live together in harmony. Now, actually, one of the reasons that he thought that is that he didn't believe that whites would ever accept them. And guess what? There's some truth in that.
And it was not without some basis of truth in that. He said, he could not contemplate a healthy biracial republic. And I think in some sense, the jury's still out.
Exactly right. We're living that problem right now.
So this is sad to think that we would have to actually make a statement like this. But before we go on in this, Joe, let me just say this. Let me ask you this. It's so easy these days to say, oh, they should have done this. And why didn't John listen to Abigail? And why didn't Jefferson do more? And why didn't they see the deep hypocrisy and so on? Of course, we'll grant all of that. We'll stipulate that. But people don't understand how complex this was and how intractable it was. If Gouverneur Morris on the one hand and James Madison on the other couldn't figure this thing out to build a constitution, it wasn't going to happen at that point in history. And to think that they should have been what we wish we were is a terrible, form of presentism.
The book is among other things, a criticism of or attack on the doctrine of presentism, that we can bring our own moral convictions back to the past and impose them on people back then. I think that then has to take precedence over now. Before we can make moral judgments about them, we have to understand the way they thought and the world they lived in. And the big problem facing the presentists, as I see it at least, is that if in fact the founders had done what they wanted, we would have never got the Constitution. Because they had to make compromises with slavery to defer the issue of ending slavery into the future. And if they didn't do that, the southern states would have bolted, the southern states being primarily Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And they wouldn't have to secede from the Union. They'd just vote against the document, and we'd go back to the form of government that we had, which was called the Articles of Confederation. Sound pretty similar. It's exactly the kind of government that the Confederation wants in 1860.
And that Jefferson preferred. He said, I like the venerable fabric of the good old Articles of Confederation. He said a couple of.
Well, Jefferson believed that the government should have power over foreign policy, but not over domestic policy. And that means you can't touch slavery.
Is that why he did it? There's this new argument that's been circulating for the past 15 or 20 years, Joe, that says that Jefferson and Madison and others of the great Southern leaders, whatever they think they were doing or said they were doing, essentially they were protecting slavery.
I think that gets true when you get into the 19th century. If you hear a Southerner say, he's for states' rights, you can be pretty darn sure what he's talking about is slavery. Yeah. But if you hear of somebody in the late 18th century talking about that, that is not necessarily the case, because the vast majority of American citizens do not want a national government that makes laws for the states. They don't. The average American, farmer, he didn't travel more than a 6-hour ride from where he lived.
All right. So I want to talk about your book. So I've read a couple of reviews, and tell me if I've got this wrong. I think we agree, but you're saying that the 1619 approach, that it's all been just vicious racism and oppression and apartheid, and that it's all just idealistic Enlightenment rhetoric behind which is just power and white supremacy and so on. You reject that, and you want to create a more nuanced, more contextualized understanding of this problem and how intractable it has been through American history. Which means you're going to get some hits. You're going to take some hits from this, from the left and from the super enlightened crowd, aren't you?
Well, I don't know where they're from. Super enlightened is not necessarily a word I would use, but yes.
The self-styled.
I've been lucky so far in the term, but yes. I mean, the founding era understood that the values they fought for in the American Revolution were incompatible with slavery. They weren't oblivious to that at all. They had made the argument throughout the 1850s and 60s, or 60s and 70s, that Great Britain was trying to enslave them. Okay? So the language itself made it impossible to ignore the contradiction that they were living. And that they did and that in 1776, they created the first emancipation society in the world in Philadelphia. Now, it was driven by religious groups, especially the Quakers, but also people who we would now call evangelicals. The evangelicals then were on the left rather than on the right. And also, it's worth noticing that the Continental Army was racially integrated. At Bunker Hill, there were about 100 African Americans serving on the Patriot side. At Yorktown, there were a little over 1,000. Over a total of about, there's disagreement on these numbers because whether you want to count militia or not, but I would say 6,000 to 7,000 African Americans fought in the Continental Army, and they fought in combat units. Integrated combat units. Guess what? The next time that's going to happen is the Korean War. Sure, blacks served in World War I and World War II, but they all served in segregated units. What I'm saying is that the full implications of the revolutionary ideology were felt and did have an impact on the debate on slavery. The problem, the deep problem, is what happens to the freed slaves? Okay.
We need to take a break there, Joe. That's a great place. I'll pick it up right after the break on that. So again, what happens after emancipation? And that's the big problem for people like Thomas Jefferson and others. You're listening to a conversation with one of my favorite people in the world, my dear friend, Joseph Ellis. When we come back, we are going to continue to talk about his most recent book, but also about a number of other things. You're listening to a very special edition of Listening to America. Stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and I'm on Zoom with my friend Joe Ellis. As usual, you're at your undisclosed location somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont. Nobody ever really knows. But
I know I'm hidden up here. The only people that know where I'm at is my dogs and my wife.
Your compound up there. The dogs have not barked yet, which is an unusual thing.
But I moved them. Oh, no, they're not here. I wanted to save your audience from them.
They'll be scratching at the door here. So, Joe, you've written a gazillion books. What possessed you here? And I want to just lay this out for you just for a second. You have won awards. You are lionized, heavily distinguished. Your books have made a huge difference in American historiography of the early national period. If you knew when you started this book that by wading into this, the big issue, the unresolved big issue of American life, that there were going to be people who said, well, he's becoming conservative. He's lost his, he's no longer one of us, and so on. You knew that by taking this on, there would be detractors because you realize how polarizing this sort of righteousness is of our time.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to do this big thing?
That's the reason, namely that it was one of the most controversial issues in our own time and in this present, and we're living through a moment on which, the current president of the United States is a person who has forced us to face certain issues about white supremacy and about actually male supremacy too, that have been pushed aside for a long time or pushed down. But where we were at before the break, the problem was not how to end slavery. To end slavery was by ending it. The problem is what happens to the freed slaves. And here's what I'm saying that's somewhat distinctive. The United States, as it's coming into existence, has a unique problem. If you free slaves in Great Britain or France or Spain or the Netherlands, it's okay. They're all an ocean away. They're in the Caribbean or they're in Latin America. If you free slaves in the colonies, there are 500,000 of them, 20% of the population. It's the highest it's ever been. The population now is 13%. In the northern states, it's small, but they're only about 15 or 20% of the total population of African Americans in the northern states, depending on how you count Maryland. But there's a huge population in the southern states. So that in the northern states, they can say, okay, we can free slavery. And between 1776 and 1802, all the northern states end slavery. Guess which is the first one?
Massachusetts?
Good guess. That's where I used to live. Where do I live now?
Oh, Vermont. Here we go.
Vermont ends it in its own state constitution in 1777. It not only frees all the slaves, it also ends the property qualification to vote and requires every county to provide an education for young men and women up to the age of 16. That's a huge achievement. My point is that in the southern states, freeing slaves was a different question. In certain counties of South Carolina, blacks outnumbered whites 8-1. And that, I know that's high, but that at any rate, they couldn't imagine living alongside freed slaves. In the northern states, they're going to say, all right, we're going to end slavery, and they end it. Then they put in racial segregation. Everybody thinks racial segregation began in the southern states after the Civil War. Racial segregation began in the northern states after the American Revolution. So you free them, but they can't vote. They can't live alongside whites. They can't serve on juries. They can't serve in the militia. They have no real rights. Okay. So, but you can't do that in the South because there are too many of them. And so the Southern position, and this is Jefferson's position, so you know it well, the only way we can end slavery is to have a plan in place that has removed all the slaves. Before there is Indian removal, there's got to be African-American removal.
And the removal would be possibly to the Caribbean, maybe to Haiti, maybe back to Africa.
There's
maybe
a lot of places.
American West, but not not amongst us.
Right. For him, it's just out of Virginia. But remember, you can't. Well, people say, well, why don't we put them in the West? Well, we don't own the West yet. That's not going to come along. But he does Jefferson does a very complicated calculation near the end of his life, and to say how much would it cost and how long would it take to remove what is now growing to 1 million slaves.
What's the logistics of removal of these people from our midst?
What's the cost and what's the logistics? How does it work? And he discovers that the cost is so high that he says, once you look at that, you never need to look at it again. But
it'll never be done. It's too expensive. It's too crazy.
It's worse than that, though. Namely, by the time you free those slaves, the current population will have doubled during that time and replaced the ones that you just thought you got rid of. So there is no answer to that problem. So Virginia's position becomes, under Jefferson, after he dies and they put it in their constitution, there can be no discussion of emancipation until we resolve this problem of removal. And that means never. And you can hear the gunfire and the Civil War going off in the background once you reach that conclusion.
A couple of questions. One is, Jefferson says in letters and even in Notes on Virginia that if you liberate this people, there will be race war, there will be reprisals, there will be violence. Was he serious? How deep was the paranoia and how realistic was it?
That's a hard question to answer. I think he was serious, and Adams actually agreed with him on that. And
that famous letter he wrote to Jefferson about nightmares of black and white armies.
That's right. And Jefferson's reason for feeling that way is because he knew that the black population had felt that they had been, imprisoned and that they were going to take no prisoners. I think the fear was real. Would that have really happened? We'll never know because it never occurred. But what it gets at is the fact that the debate we're currently having in this version of America has its origins in the founding era, and it's a long-standing debate. And Martin Luther King liked to say that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. And he also said, when he appeared on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to give the I Have a Dream speech,
1963 August, that amazing moment in American history.
I was there, by the way.
You were?
I had my feet in the pool there. Yeah, guy sitting next to me was a big basketball player, and anyway, I've come to collect on a promissory note written by Thomas Jefferson. Right? Okay.
All men are created equal. Every time we try to take that to the Bank of American Justice, it's returned for insufficient funds.
And he said that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. In some ways, that's true, but it doesn't bend evenly. It's like a roller coaster ride, and it's a really backlash pattern. It's ironic. Once we make significant progress towards a form of racial equality, it generates a hostility. We're going through another chapter in that story now. It generates racism. Or another way to put it, there is a steady pool of racial prejudice beneath the surface of American society that once you start to get, let's say you get a black person in the White House, okay? Oh my God. And there are a heck of a lot of Americans, some of the people who are our dearest friends, who really don't believe they believe in white supremacy. And I think that's the current constituency there's two constituencies that serve the current president. One is billionaires, and the other is people who really are believers in white male supremacy.
So you could make the argument, Joe, that in the last 25 years, and really almost since the 1960s, there's been so much progressive change in the country. We've come so far, so fast. Gay Americans, the LGBT community, the civil rights movement, American Indians and the American Indian movement, and so on, that all of these things have come, but there's been a kind of a simmering rage. And at some point, there had to be a Newtonian reaction, and we're living in the heart of it.
That is exactly what I think. Yes. I mean, and that up until now, up until fairly recently, I always thought, well, what does again mean? How far back does again go? And you just went through it, certainly before Obama, before the Civil Rights Movement, before Brown versus Board of Education, and now maybe it's before the New Deal. And
well, so at least before Gloria Steinem, the new sort of masculine
right,
toxicity movement is
right.
against that too, right?
But here's a thought I have not shared with anybody, so your listeners.
Ooh, breaking news.
Breaking news here. It's before the American Revolution. Because, and I think that one of the things I want all of our listeners to eventually do is read the Declaration of Independence. Just read it and then argue about what do you think it means, okay? But the irony is the current occupant of the White House believes that he's the second coming of George III, mainly a monarch, and that now, some people might not think he really thinks that. I think it's pretty obvious that he thinks that. And
I don't know that he thinks that. I think that he has the instinct of monarchical control.
Exactly. A group of Harvard psychiatrists diagnosed him as a malignant narcissist. That means that he cannot process information about any authority other than himself. Can be no such thing as the rule of law for him because he is a law unto himself. Whether you want to call him a king or a dictator or a mafia boss, that at the very time we honor the values of the American Revolution, and it's the first, there are two revolutionary moments. One when we win the war and declare independence, and one we declare nationhood. That's 11 years later, but that's the reason I want people to read the Declaration now. And there are places in there, if you read it, especially the second paragraph, the brilliant one, because we hold these truths to be self-evident. Jefferson originally wrote, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. I think it's Franklin that changed
Franklin said, no, it's got to be.
No, we don't need God in this thing, yeah. And but then he goes into a paragraph that says, of course, governments ought not to be changed for light and transient causes, right? So, and then he says, however,
once there's a pattern,
read that next pattern, okay? It's an accurate description of what we're living through right now. Ultimately, why do I keep doing what I'm doing, you ask me? Because I really believe in dialogue. I'm an old teacher, and that we need to come and argue. The Constitution isn't a set of truths. It's a context in which we argue about what the truths are.
Wait a minute, say that again. That's so important. It's not it's not mosaic law. It's a basis for a national ongoing conversation.
Correct. Yes. And that's the sad thing is that American higher education has failed us incredibly. Only about 20% of the people have a college degree, and less than that could pass the civics test required of all incoming immigrants for citizenship. So that sometimes I pretend I have conversations with the founders. Like I love to talk to John Adams. I love John Adams, but mostly because of Abigail too. And
yes, of course. Who isn't attracted to Abigail?
I called him up and I said, what would you think if I described this thing we've created in the 20th and 21st century called the internet? And you know what he said?
No, what did he say? Who is this, John?
John.
All right.
He said, you are effed.
Do you think he ever used the F word?
Oh, and Abigail corrected him, said, don't you use language like that. And you can tell them the truth, but don't, just tell them they're on their own. We never foresaw this, but 83% of the American electorate gets their information not from programs like this or from even newspapers, but from the internet, where it's all, one of the reasons they said they didn't form a democracy. In fact, democracy is an epithet throughout the founding era up until the age of Jackson. They founded a republic, res publica, things of the public. The public is different from the people. At any given moment, the people can be easily deceived and usually are, or just plain ignorant. So what we should say is we need to save the American republic, not American democracy.
How do we account for this? How do we account for the fact that we now have a constitutional order, if we do, in which we have a runaway executive? And I'm only saying that because he says that's what he wants to do. He doesn't make any attempt to cover this up. We have a Senate that is a rubber stamp, a House of Representatives that's worse. We have a Supreme Court that has shown no capability of resisting in any significant way. How did this happen?
There's a book that a woman that writes for the New Yorker did, Dark Money.
Jane Mayer.
That's one side of it, namely that the role of money in terms of politics, the reason why these things have deteriorated, have taken 20 years to develop, okay, not a single thing, but that's where we're at. I think the coming midterm elections will be the most important midterm elections in American history.
I do too. I'm worried about that. But let me just go back to this for a moment. So you're talking Citizens United, the role of giant money,
Right.
the incredible wedge between the average American and the super rich, now the billionaires of billionaires, and the way that they control the system. And we're sitting in the front row at the inauguration in 2025. Right. But also, Joe, I am a Jeffersonian, and I have to say I'm very disappointed with the American people, because Donald Trump was a president for one term. We can explain how that happened. There's an interregnum where Joe Biden is president. We knew who Trump was. His closest associates and members of his official circle said, "Don't do it. Don't do it, America." Trump makes no bones about his character, about his contempt for this or that norm, certainly even the Constitution. And yet, my friend, we reelected him. And not just reelected him, but we did it with some decisiveness. But here's my question for you, and we need to take a break in a minute, so I'm going to ask you to make a short answer for the moment. Did you think that towards the end of your life, you would watch the death of the Republic?
No.
You couldn't have planned that. We couldn't have thought that. We couldn't have ever thought this would happen.
I think that now, and in some ways, I guess when you ask why I write the book, because I think I have to join that argument and make the case where we're at and how threatening it is. And I would say that these two very young people who head the No Kings movement, they really are impressive people. They really know their history. But we got to vote, but it's not about the cost of eggs. It's about the
Do
future.
you worry, as we go to break, that the 2026 midterms might actually affirm and consolidate the Trump revolution?
I don't think that's likely. I do think that they will be rigged. If the Democrats win seats in the House and the Senate, that Trump will attempt to claim that they're not legal, and so that it will be an endless legalistic argument.
Do you think he'll turn loose his goons? Do you think there will be another January 6th sort of on people on the streets?
That's not what I think. And although that violence could happen in certain places, but it would be more of a legalistic challenge on a state by state basis in the red states. But I think that the electorate, all the polls show that Trump is at 37%. Now he's not on a ticket, but that the Republican candidates can't even make presentations back in the home state of being booed out.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. So I haven't completely lost faith. I'm an ex-Catholic. I still hold on to certain faith.
So we need to take a break. This is a fascinating conversation. When we come back, I want to ask you more about the two sort of fundamental sins of American history: the dispossession of Native Americans and the intractable issue of race and slavery. This is a special edition of Listening to America with my friend, Dr. Joseph Ellis of Vermont. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. Joe Ellis is at the other end of the country at an undisclosed location. I'm happy to give my address in Bismarck, North Dakota. I have nothing to hide. I don't have to hide behind some kind of Green Mountain Boys militia movement, but that's fine, Joe. We can accept that. I'm looking at your library. There are books. You just don't stop writing. You retired from teaching a long time ago. Right. You could have just enjoyed a quiet life.
Yeah.
Why are you still scribbling, my friend?
Because when you retire, it's like going through the sound change,
the sound barrier.
Sound barrier. It shakes and rattles, but it's calm on the other side. But I have two identities: one as a teacher and one as a writer.
That's right.
teachers, that's a social thing. Writing is a solitary thing.
It certainly is.
And you can do this on top of a mountain in Vermont. And, I'm doing it longhand too. And
You're still writing longhand.
still, it's not with a quill pen, but it is.
You don't have a Remington old typewriter that you clock away on like David McCullough?
Not even a typewriter. But it's what I do because it makes me a fulfilled human being. I do 4 to 6 hours of work at this desk that I'm sitting at now, and it keeps my mind alive at a time when my brain cells and yours are all dying at a heavy rate, and I can't remember names as well as I used to.
Oh man, that's a plague.
Everybody I say that to, good. I was at Woodstock, and I said I have a problem remembering names, and they said all of us have a problem remembering.
No, it comes with the territory. So Joe, Dr. Johnson said that writing is a universal conspiracy for the destruction of forests. How many more books are you going to write here, honey? How many more you got in you? Is this it, or do you have more?
I'm going to keep going until I die, and I'm working on a next thing called Memories. Lost stories from the American founding, things that people don't know about that they should. But I want to, right now I've stepped away from that. I need to promote the current book.
Has this book come out yet? I see it's being reviewed.
It's just out officially. You can get it. And whether it does well or not is obviously important to me. But what's most important is to write a book that forces people to engage with the issues of the American founding and the way in which we're failing in certain respects in the present, to be sure, and to connect then and now. That's what I know how to do. Like somebody said, a student came up to me at Mount Holyoke one time and said, I think I want to become a poet. And I said, the name of the game is to figure out what you really want to do and then get somebody to pay you for it. And you've worked
that out. You've told me that several of your books put your children through universities, and so it's worked.
My 2 eldest boys got through college because of Founding Brothers. And, if I wasn't paid anything, I'd still be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, the new book is called The Great Contradiction, The Tragic Side of the American Founding. So, Joe, okay, so I've heard you talk about this in different ways, and I'm fascinated. I'll soon be reading the book, and I can't wait. I always devour whatever you put in front of the historical community.
I had a guy came up to me once who had been forced to read Founding Brothers in high school or something, and he said this one paragraph. He said it must be great to sit down and write that paragraph and just And I said, that took about 2 weeks.
Right, and make it look easy, don't you? The clarity and
I got a call once from the Columbia School of Journalism to come and talk. And they said that the first chapter in Founding Brothers, it's about the duel, they said they want you to come down. I want you to come down and talk about how you told that story, because you change tenses and you go in and out of persons' minds without telling the reader and all this. And then they had all this fancy language about and I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I just wrote what was in my head. I'm not coming down because I got nothing to tell you. And
there ain't no grand strategy. It's just writing the story
at all. Yeah.
But I remember when I first encountered you through American Sphinx, and I was annoyed by the title, and I still am annoyed by it, but I'll leave that aside. But when I first encountered you, I thought, man, this guy is clear. And what I really love about you is that you don't write biographies, you write treatment books. I don't want to hear about Jefferson's genealogy, and I don't want to hear about the schools he went to, and I don't want to hear about, the family moved to Tuckahoe. I can get that from Merrill Peterson. I can get that from Dumas Malone. I can get that from all sorts of people. You don't bother with that. You go right to the heart of certain moments in the life of these people that help to illuminate American history.
I taught a course on biography at West Point too, as a matter of fact, and it was very popular. Trying to come to terms with another person's life is a way of finding out what your own life means. At any rate, let's go to the 2 issues.
All right. So okay, with slavery, we get. I mean, I know you've felt this all of your life, Joe. It would be so much better if this had never happened to us, if this idealistic Enlightenment republic based upon Montesquieu and Polybius and the rule of law and the dignity of man and the rights of man had not had to absorb this fundamental awful thing at the center of our life. Indeed. But with Native Americans, the whole project could not exist without dispossession. I mean, the American project required dislocation and dispossession, didn't it?
It did. And I've been watching TV recently in which I see your face and I say, oh my God, what's he doing? And it's the session that's being produced about Western Western.
Yeah, Doris Kearns Goodwin's thing with Kevin Costner.
Yeah. And you know a lot about that. I didn't know you
I
knew
know
about
stuff, man. I wish you, I know stuff.
Yeah,
I know Joe Ellis, but I know
all
stuff.
the Indian chiefs and all that stuff. But the last chapter in the book is called The Treaty. It's about the Treaty of New York, passed in 1790. Washington is approached by his old artillery commander, a guy who looks like Santa Claus, whose name is escaping me, who says, if we don't
It's not Henry Knox, is it?
No, it's
somebody else. All right.
Yeah. If we don't do something, the last Indian east of the Mississippi will only be seen in the history books. Right now, we're headed towards Indian removal, and we've got to stop it. We fought a revolution because we refused to be taxed without our consent. It is equally a violation of our values to take the land from the Native Americans without their consent.
I've wrestled with this all of my life. I know you have too. Was it inevitable? Could it have been otherwise? Is there some alternative way that this might have unfolded? You think like permanent Indian territory in Oklahoma, that didn't hold. The proclamation of 1763, in which the British tried to contain these settlers, that didn't hold. But when the government got stronger, say around 1840, 1850, 1860, and so in Jefferson's time, there's no force in America that could have prevented this. That tiny army spread across an immense wilderness. But by 1850 or 60, could we have, as a nation, said, we're going to leave Oklahoma and part of the Dakotas and part of Wyoming and Colorado as what George Catlin said, as kind of a permanent Indian nation, a buffalo nation. We could have enforced that then. By then, we'd lost the will to do it. But don't you think that if we had really, really wanted to, we could have carved out a part of the immense continent to leave alone?
I'd like to believe that, but my mind says only a couple thousand frontal lobotomies would not be necessary for that to happen. And that was the right course.
Let's talk about Jefferson for a minute, because you give him some fairly high marks early in the Washington administration. But my sense is that Jefferson, the president, is writing to Harrison out in Indiana country saying, look, we don't want to go to war with natives. So, give them generous credit at the trading for it so they get into big debt. And when they can't pay their debts, then just lop off part of Iowa or lop off part of Indiana or Ohio.
I remember that, yes.
And that's Jefferson's strategy, that there's an alternative to war. He loves economic alternatives to war, but we are going to take their land. And I think when people ask me about this, I say this: Jefferson was not going to let Native Americans get in the way of his dream of this country. He was hoping that it would work out more benignly, as he always did. He loves magical thinking, but he was not going to permit this entity that he certainly saw as interesting but lesser to get in the way of the dream he had of this country.
I'm afraid you're right. I mean, you are right.
Isn't that sad?
Yes, it is. My earlier form of sadness on the slavery issue is that, he dies and because he doesn't own his slaves and he has to sell them all. And all those slaves that he promised to protect are, sold down the river in some cases. That's a sad, sad moment. But Jefferson avoids ever having to face it by dying.
He has magical thinking, Joe. So I want to ask you a question about that, because, during the Missouri Compromise, during that period, 1819, 1820, 1821, Jefferson gets into a dark mood and says, I hate to go to my grave knowing that the sacrifices that we made are going to be jeopardized and so on. Don't you think that he realized, A, you can't repatriate because the costs are too high. B, the reproduction rate in this population is such that the problem is only going to grow worse. He sees that the cotton gin is revolutionizing American agriculture. He sees that the South has a stranglehold on the Senate. It seems to me that Jefferson's basic instinct is one for freedom, but he lost the will to act. And by the end of his life, he thinks, oh my gosh, this thing is headed towards civil war. Don't you think that's what happened to him?
I think he realizes that, but he doesn't want to think about it. The founders didn't foresee that. Jefferson didn't foresee it. And they didn't foresee political parties. Jefferson himself said, if I must go to heaven with in a party, I prefer not to go at all. Yet he founds the first opposition party, right?
No, that was Madison. Jefferson just came along for the ride. You know that, Joe. You know that.
We're going to end on a big argument here.
No, we're going to end on another question. So here's my question for you. It goes back to the arc of justice. Jefferson believed that things were just going to get better, that the next generation would be more enlightened than his own, that the revolution was not over, that we would renew by tearing up the Constitution, and that the science, by which he meant knowledge, would spread, and we would just become the most extraordinary people who ever walked on earth, and so on. And to a certain extent, you could say that has been the trajectory of American history, that we did emancipate slaves. There was this
bump in the road called the Civil War.
Well, I know, but you said the arc is a roller coaster, but you could argue that it has been a pretty great thing that we have accomplished here, and it's not over yet. So how do you think this is a temporary reaction after which there is more progressivism so that we become a perfect union, or do you think we're in a really deep trouble here?
Boy, that's the big question I've asked myself today.
You got to sort this out. We got 5 minutes.
The answer is my Jeffersonian side says the future is going to get better. My Adams side says, well, we're in deep trouble here. And so those two voices keep talking to me.
But you think Adams is the better reader of human nature?
Yes, he is. I'm afraid so. Jefferson's values are so seductively attractive.
Intoxicating.
Yes, they are. And
even you are intoxicated by Jefferson
from time to time. I am. And I don't want to go out against them altogether. And I don't want to tear down Monticello or any of that kind of stuff. And I think he deserves a monument on the Mall. I, by the way, as you know, think that so Adams thinks that there should be a monument on the Mall too.
Oh, here we go. Well, his monument is in the White House. It says that he made peace with France in 1898 and 99, 1798 and 99.
He said the reason he lost the election of 1800 to Jefferson was because he refused to go to war with France.
Exactly, but it was his proudest achievement.
Proudest day of his life, yes.
Yeah.
And
so there's your monument. There
ought to be a monument to Adams on the tidal basin, located close enough to Jefferson that they can, and that's at certain angles of light, that they take turns trading shadows against each other each day. And
I like that, Joe, but here's what I would call it. I would have a rotunda, and then I would say his rotunda tea. You remember he was called his rotundity by his...
Oh, his rotundity when he was coming...
His rotunda tea, that could be his monument.
Well, that would not be nice. I think that...
Do you really think that I agree that he deserves better than he's had by far. And I think
there ought to be a monument to him and Abigail and maybe John Quincy, and it should be a little library. One of my major contributions is to say that all these guys weren't mythical figures, right?
They were men like other men.
They were human beings just like us. Adams is the one that cannot be made mythical, okay? That in order to make it to the Mall, you have to have a mythical identity, and Washington's very good at that. Jefferson's very good at that. Adams is not very good at that. That's the reason we need a monument to him. We need a monument to an ordinary human being who happened to be great.
But Joe, you know what I'm about to say. Adams couldn't stand success, so he ached to be treated the way you want him to be treated. He wanted to be the great man. He wanted everyone to understand how deeply important he was. But if he had ever achieved it, he would have had to grumble because he was a Calvinist at heart, and he could never really enjoy success.
True enough. But even though that's okay, he can die, but then we can appreciate him. I think Adams is one of the major players, one of the six major, founders. And
absolutely, maybe the first four.
Why isn't there a monument to him? And there is the Adams Library, I guess, or next to that kind of thing. But
there is the book by one Joseph Ellis called "Passionate Sage."
Yeah.
That is my favorite of your books.
See, people say, if they came back and you could have a beer with somebody, who would you like to have a beer with? And I always say Adams, because he's
toothless and sputtering and self-whining and self-pitying. I would be with
You're being
Jefferson.
as hostile towards Adams as I sometimes am towards Jefferson.
Jefferson would serve you claret, and he would serve you exquisite desserts, and his conversation
It would be served by the slaves around
he
him.
would draw you out. He would make you feel like you were the most important person who had ever visited Monticello. Yes, you'd be served by enslaved people. Let me ask a closing question here.
All right.
If John Adams, if New England had prevailed and the South, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, etc., if they had not been the nursery of much of the revolution, if it had really been a New England affair, we might have done better. We might have addressed slavery right then. We might have had a better response to the problem of Native Americans in the West. Don't you think that, I have to say it, and I hate to say it, but don't you think the South is really the source of much of the agony of American history?
As a Virginian, went to William and Mary, yes, but here's the but, and that's part of the book. You don't win the revolution without the South. Okay,
of course.
You can't. You don't get the Constitution without the South. It could have worked. I've never thought about this. In the Southern campaigns in 1780, 79 and 80, there's this doctrine that the European powers have adopted that said, it's called udi possidetis. It means whoever controls the land at the end of the war gets it. So both sides are trying to control the land. That's how they put Cornwallis in. But if Cornwallis had been successful in his Southern campaigns, if there hadn't been a Yorktown, there would have had to been a negotiation to end the war in which Britain could claim everything south of Virginia as its own. That is a possibility, but I'm
good with that. I wish Gouverneur Morris had prevailed and went at the Constitutional Convention, and when South Carolina, which was the worst of them at the convention, kept holding the country and the future of America hostage. I wish that Gouverneur Morris had prevailed when he said, let him go. Just let him go.
Gouverneur Morris is one of the most, everybody knows. You ask him this question: who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson. So you ask him, who wrote the Constitution? Nobody knows. It's Gouverneur Morris. And Gouverneur Morris was a guy who also was famous for having a certain affection for other men's wives. And,
yes, and he lost his life theoretically, according to his own rumors, by escaping from a carriage at the
right. I think that's
Joe, we're out of time. I'm so sorry, but I want people to get your books, and especially the new one, The Great Contradiction, The Tragic Side of the American Founding. Joe Ellis, will you come back in a few weeks? Because there are many more questions I want to ask you about the current difficult situation.
It's been fun for me. We're living through a tough time. We're living through a historically significant moment in our anniversary of independence. A lot of podcasts and a lot of movies and a lot of films are going to be appearing on TV. But I think we want to be able to create a dialogue here that is intellectually sophisticated, but connected to the core ideas, right?
Exactly. And I love sparring with you more than any other person in the world. Joe Ellis, thank you so much. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.